Michael Cohen made headlines because he was President Trump's private attorney for more than 2 decades. That role put him in some hot water with prosecutors, and he was eventually indicted. He was convicted. He was sentenced to federal prison. He got released from federal prison to serve a portion of his term on home confinement. But today, July the 9th, 2020, he is back inside of a federal prison, and I'm going to describe for you what I know about that right now. My name is Michael Santos. I am with Prison Professors, and if you're interested in getting this kind of news about how the prison system operates, and more importantly, how a person can get through it effectively and get out at the soonest possible time, please subscribe to the channel. We are sponsored by CBDTV.com, which provides us with resources so that we can produce new content every single day. And we think it's really important for people to get this type of content so that we can improve the outcomes of the criminal justice system, not only for communities outside, but also for people who are experiencing it. We don't want people having the experience of Michael Cohen that he had today. Now, many of you who are fans of this program understand that earlier this year, I think it was in March of 2020, the Attorney General took an unprecedented move in response to the coronavirus pandemic. What did he do? He authorized the Bureau of Prisons to begin releasing people from prison to home confinement. Now, that authorization didn't come with a real strong wording the first time, but the second memorandum that the Attorney General issued really gave a very strong mandate to the director of the Bureau of Prisons to exercise his discretion in releasing as many people as possible to home confinement, so that they could serve the rest of their sentence. And the reason is obvious on why they would do that. Coronavirus was starting to rage across the country. People in prison did not have the ability to practice the procedures of social distancing and other factors that the CDC has encouraged. In fact, people in prison could be construed as being really vulnerable because they're breathing in the air. And right now, of course, there's a lot of news about the coronavirus being airborne. Well, people can't isolate themselves in federal prison. And although the Bureau of Prisons can take measurements to stop visiting and stop family members of people in prison from coming in through visits, they can't stop the fact that staff members come in to the prison every day on 3 different shifts. And if they're carrying the virus, the people in prison become really vulnerable. And I think that you've seen a lot of news reports showing how prisons have become petri dishes, as they say, petri dishes for the coronavirus. And it just spreads horrifically. And people inside are getting sick, and many of them are dying. In fact, the Bureau of Prisons website features a section on coronavirus, and it shows just how many people have been tested, how many people have been contracted the virus, and how many people have died. And they just can't get the health care that they need if they're in there, nor can they separate themselves from other people. So they're significantly more vulnerable. And so the Attorney General invoked the CARES Act, which was part of one of the bills, the legislation in response to the COVID pandemic. And that by invoking the CARES Act, more than several thousand people have since been released from the Bureau of Prisons to go to home confinement. That doesn't mean that their sentence has been altered. That doesn't mean that they are free. It just means that they are going to serve their term on home confinement, which means that they're going to have restrictions. And because they are still federal prisoners, the Bureau of Prisons has a wide measure of control or authority on what conditions to impose. Now, some people were able to get out simply by submitting a request to the staff members of the prison system. Sometimes the staff members went to the prisoners themselves and offered to release them. In fact, just last week, I featured a video of a young man who didn't have any idea he was going to be released from prison. It was just on the staff's own initiative. They put him forward as a candidate for release. They put about 30 people, and within a couple of weeks, they went into quarantine in the prison, and then they went to home confinement. But when they went to home confinement, they didn't get a lot of guidance on what they could or could not do. So the important thing to remember is that if you don't know what conditions that you have when you're transitioning from prison to home confinement, it's really important to err on the side of caution because a person is not free. And in Michael Cohen's case, according to a news report today that I will link to in the show notes below, he had some very specific restrictions, which I don't really understand. One of them is that he didn't have the ability or the authority to interact with the media. That was number one. And number two, he didn't have the authority to write books. Well, in the Bureau of Prisons, there are policy statements which indicate a person does have a First Amendment right to interact with the media, and an individual does have a First Amendment right to write a book. So I don't know if Michael Cohen had very specific restrictions. What I do know is that he was a very high-profile prisoner. He also had the ire of the President of the United States, and by virtue of him, the President of the United States being angry at him, we know that the Attorney General would have been angry with him. And the Attorney General, of course, oversees the Bureau of Prisons. So if I were Michael Cohen, I would have been very cautious and grateful to have been home with my family, because the alternative is where he is standing right now, inside of a federal prison. Apparently, according to the news report that I watched, he was spotted inside of a restaurant. And while he was in a restaurant, of course, an ambitious photographer snapped a picture of him, and that landed him on the cover of the New York Daily News over the weekend. Well, that's not the kind of thing that the president would want to see. That's not the kind of thing that the Attorney General would want to see. And they, of course, have the power to help prosecutors or nudge prosecutors along or nudge the Bureau of Prisons along to take action. And apparently that is exactly what happened to Michael Cohen. Because according to the news report, he went to court today for what he thought was going to be a routine appearance to adjust his ankle bracelet on home confinement, but instead he was taken into custody and not to be heard from again, and he will not be heard from for quite some time, because my guess is that he's going to immediately go through administrative remedy procedures to try and reinstate that home confinement matter. The problem is he doesn't have a right to home confinement. That is a discretionary call. The Attorney General had authorized the Director of the Bureau of Prisons to use discretion on who should be released to home confinement. And Michael Cohen apparently fit that category for whatever the reasons may be. Nevertheless, the fact is that that privilege was revoked today, and he was back inside of the Bureau of Prisons, where he is now wondering, why did I put myself in the limelight and upset the powers that be? The reality is that if you are a federal prison, it's really important to understand the system and to understand what can I do to work towards the best possible outcome. He had the best possible outcome. He was in prison serving a multi-year sentence. He got released in less than half the time, and he was going to serve the remainder of his term at home, meaning he would have been sleeping in his bed with his family. He would have been eating at home. He would have been eventually gotten some parameters on what he could or could not do. But one thing, even if you had authority to go out to a restaurant to eat dinner, even if you had the authority to go to a job, if you're a high-profile person, what you want to do is avoid causing more anger to the powers that be. You've got to know thy enemy. And this is not a system that is about really justice. And sometimes it's about vengeance. And the more that I understand that, the more I can put myself in a position to get the best possible outcome. If you are watching this video inside of a jail or prison because you're part of the Prison Professors program, I would really caution you to understand this. On the Prison Professors channel, we feature all types of people who get what the term is violated. The authorities consider them for violating the terms or the conditions of their release, and they go back to prison, not for new criminal conduct, but for something as trivial as having a meal inside of a restaurant, possibly without permission, or possibly being in the media without permission, or possibly filling out a credit card statement, as we featured an earlier person a couple of weeks ago who is back in prison, not for new criminal conduct, but for violating the terms or the conditions of their release. And those are just some of the ancillary consequences of mass incarceration. And it's one of the reasons that we feel so passionately about wanting to present this information to people so that they can avoid those types of complications, so that they can restore their dignity and get their life back on track and begin building a life of meaning and relevance and contribution. Michael Cohen can still do that, but it looks like he's going to be doing that from inside of a federal prison where he will serve the remainder of his term, kicking himself every single day for putting himself in the crosshairs of powerful people that could take away his liberty, not for committing a crime, but simply because they have the power to do so. So if you're interested in getting this kind of information, please subscribe to the Prison Professors channel. We have a channel on YouTube, we have a channel on iTunes, and of course we publish regularly on the Prison Professors website. That's the way we strive to be the change that we want to see in the world. And if you want to support our program, we would appreciate comments below so that we can respond to you. I try to respond to every comment. But in addition to that, I really would hope that you support our sponsors at cbdtv.com. They provide us with the resources that we need to produce content every single day in an effort to try and improve outcomes of what we consider to be the greatest social injustice of our time, which are the ancillary consequences of mass incarceration. I am Michael Santos, and I thank you for being a part of our community.